The world seemed to crack apart like sun-dried clay. It was May 1940 when Nazi Germany's war machine rolled across Europe, and Henno Martin knew that time had run out. He sat in his modest office in Windhoek, capital of Southwest Africa, staring at the official notice that had just arrived. All German nationals were to report for internment within 48 hours. Enemy aliens, they were called now. Enemies of the British Crown. Hermann, Henno said quietly, folding the paper with deliberate care. We have a choice to make. Hermann Korn looked up from his geological maps, his weathered face creasing with concern. Internment? Or the desert? The two men's eyes met. They had spoken of this possibility before, half joking over beers after long days mapping water sources in the wilderness. If war comes, they had said, we'll go to the desert, but now the joke had become deadly serious. When? Hermann asked. We leave tomorrow before dawn. Outside the window, Windhoek continued its afternoon rhythm, cars passing on Kaiser Street, pedestrians moving between shops, the normal flow of colonial life. But for Henno and Hermann, normalcy had ended the moment Britain declared war on Germany 9 months earlier. They had watched as other German nationals were rounded up, questioned, sent to camps. They had hoped their work as geologists, their obvious distance from Nazi politics, might protect them. That hope was gone now. Henno Martin had been born on March 15, 1910, in Freiburg, Germany, into a world that would be shattered twice by global war before he reached middle age. As a boy, he had been fascinated by rocks, not as dead things, but as books written in a language older than words. He would spend hours turning over stones in the Black Forest, examining the striations and layers, imagining the ancient seas and volcanic fires that had shaped them. His father, a schoolteacher with a love of natural philosophy, encouraged this curiosity, though he could not have known it would lead his son to the far edge of the civilized world. Henno had studied geology at the University of Freiburg, then at Göttingen, where the science was rigorous and the professors demanding. It was there, in 1933, that he met Hermann Korn. Hermann was older by a few years, quieter, with a methodical mind that complemented Henno's more intuitive approach. While Henno could look at a landscape and sense where water might hide beneath the surface, Hermann could calculate the exact depth and volume. Together they made an effective team. They had also shared something more important than scientific aptitude, a deep discomfort with the direction Germany was taking. In 1933, the same year they met, Hitler had come to power. The universities began to change. Jewish professors dismissed, political loyalty demanded, academic freedom strangled, books were burned in the streets. Students who asked difficult questions disappeared. For two young men who believed in evidence and reason, who thought science should serve humanity rather than ideology, Germany was becoming unbearable. When the opportunity came in 1935 to work in Southwest Africa, they seized it eagerly. The territory, that vast, barely mapped expanse of desert and mountain that Germany had lost after the First World War, needed geologists. Underground water sources needed to be found for the scattered farms and towns. Mineral deposits needed to be assessed. It was meaningful work in a land so ancient and vast that human politics seemed irrelevant. For 5 years they had thrived in the territory, now administered by the Union of South Africa. They mapped underground aquifers, using seismic surveys and drill cores. They searched for diamonds, copper, tungsten. They fell in love with the harsh ancient landscapes of the Namib Desert. The Namib, its name meant vast place in the Nama language, was one of the oldest deserts on Earth. A landscape of such primal beauty and terror that it seemed to exist outside of human time. Here they thought they had found freedom. Hermann Korn spoke less of his past than Henno did. He had grown up somewhere in rural Germany. The exact details remained vague, even after years of friendship. He had come to geology through a love of mountains, through climbing the Alps as a young man, and wanting to understand the forces that had built them. Where Henno saw poetry and rocks, Hermann saw mathematics, the precise angles and pressures that built continents and ground them down again. He was practical, steady, the anchor to Henno's occasionally soaring imagination. He was also a pacifist, a man who had seen enough of human cruelty in the Germany of the 1930s to want no part in any war, regardless of which side claimed righteousness. Neither man had any sympathy for Hitler's regime. They were scientists, not soldiers. They believed in evidence, not ideology. When they met other Germans in Windhoek's small expatriate community, They avoided political discussions. They had learned that silence was safer than honesty. But their German passports made them suspect, and when Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, and South Africa as a British dominion followed suit, their status changed overnight. They were no longer welcome guests, but potential enemies. The Second World War had begun on September 1st, 1939, when German forces invaded Poland. Within days, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The dominoes fell quickly. South Africa, though internally divided, many Afrikaners sympathized with Germany and resented British imperial control, officially entered the war on Britain's side on September 6th. The vote in the South African parliament had been close, bitter, nearly tearing the country apart. But it passed, and South Africa was at war. For the several thousand German nationals living in Southwest Africa, this created an impossible situation. Most, like Henno and Hermann, had no desire to fight for Hitler. Many were refugees from Nazism themselves, intellectuals and dissidents who had fled the Third Reich. But the government in Pretoria and the administrators in Windhoek could not make such fine distinctions. All German citizens were classified as enemy aliens and subject to internment for the duration of the war. The law was clear, inflexible, indifferent to individual circumstances. Internment meant camps, not death camps, like those the Nazis were beginning to build in Europe, though Henno and Hermann did not yet know the full horror of what was happening there. But prison camps nonetheless. Barbed wire, guards, crowded barracks, years of wasted life waiting for a war to end that might go on indefinitely. For men who had spent 5 years mapping the wilderness, men who woke each morning to horizons that seemed to stretch to infinity, the thought of confinement was unbearable. It was not physical fear, the camps were not brutal, but something deeper, a kind of death of the spirit. "We could go back to Germany," Hermann had said one night a few weeks earlier as they discussed their dwindling options. They were sitting on the veranda of the house they rented on the edge of town, drinking beer, watching the sun set over the Hochland Mountains to the west. "To what?" Henno had replied. "To fight in a war we don't believe in, to watch our country destroy itself. We could try to prove we're not Nazis, show them our work, our character. Someone must be willing to listen. To whom? With what evidence? Our word against our passports. Hermann, they don't care what we believe, they only care what we are. And we're Germans, therefore we're enemies. Logic doesn't enter into it." Hermann had been silent for a long time, staring at his beer. Finally he said, "Then we go to the desert." It had seemed half fantasy then, but now with the internment notice in hand, it became reality. They had perhaps 48 hours to prepare, to gather everything they would need to survive for an indefinite period in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It should have been impossible. But they were geologists. They knew the desert. They knew where water hid beneath sand and stone. They knew how to read the landscape. If anyone could survive in the Namib, it was them. That evening they worked by lamplight, making lists, calculating how much food could they carry, how much water, what tools were essential. They approached it like a scientific problem, systematic and thorough. They had one enormous advantage, their work truck, a sturdy Chevrolet that could handle rough terrain. They could carry far more than if they had to go on foot. They chose their destination carefully, the Kuiseb Canyon, a deep gorge cut by the seasonal Kuiseb River through the northern edge of the Namib, about 90 kilometers east of the coastal town of Walvis Bay. They had been there before, multiple times, mapping its geology and searching for water. Sources: it was remote, accessible only by rough tracks that few people traveled. The canyon walls would provide shelter from wind and sun. The river, though it flowed only a few weeks per year after rare rains, left behind pools that sometimes lasted months. And their geological surveys had suggested underground water sources might exist in the permeable rock layers beneath the canyon floor. If they were careful, if they were lucky, they could remain hidden indefinitely. They spent the night loading the truck, working in darkness to avoid attention. Food came first: sacks of flour and rice and dried beans, tins of condensed milk and preserved vegetables and meat, sugar and salt and coffee. They took far more than seemed reasonable for 2 men, but this was not a camping trip. This might be years. They loaded axes and saws and shovels, knives and rope and canvas tarps. They loaded their hunting rifle, a .22 caliber, small but accurate and economical with ammunition, and boxes of cartridges. They loaded blankets and spare clothes and their precious shortwave radio receiver with extra batteries. They loaded medical supplies, bandages, antiseptics, basic medicines. They loaded notebooks and pencils for recording observations because they were scientists, and documentation mattered even at the end of the world. They loaded books because sanity would matter too. Herman's dog came with them, of course. Otto, a wire-haired terrier, small and tough and loyal. The dog sensed something unusual was happening. He sat in the truck cab between them, ears pricked alert. On May 25th of 1940, 2 hours before dawn, they drove out of Windhoek for the last time. The city slept. The stars overhead were so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Henno drove, while Herman navigated with map and compass, following rough tracks that were barely visible even in daylight. They spoke little. What was there to say? They had made their choice. Everything they had known, their work, their friends, their connection to civilization, was behind them now. Ahead lay only sand and stone, and an uncertain future. The sun rose as they drove west, turning the sky from black to purple to fierce gold. Heat came with it, pressing down like a physical weight, even through the truck windows. The landscape transformed around them from highland savanna to the first edges of true desert. The vegetation thinned, fewer trees, more scrub, then just isolated plants clinging to life in an ocean of sand and rock. The Namib opened before them, ancient and indifferent and terrifyingly beautiful. The truck bounced and lurched over rocks that had been placed there by geological forces millions of years before humans existed. Henno gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as they descended from the highland plateau toward the coastal desert. The temperature climbed with every kilometer westward. 25 degrees at dawn, 30 by mid-morning, 35 as they approached the canyon. The air through the open windows felt like breath from an oven. Herman navigated, calling out directions from the maps spread across his lap. Otto panted between them, tongue lolling, his wire-haired coat already dusty. They had brought water for the dog in a special canvas bag that hung from the side mirror, cooling by evaporation. Every hour they stopped briefly to let Otto drink and to stretch their own cramped legs. The Namib revealed itself gradually, like a truth too vast to comprehend all at once. First came the gravel plains, endless flat expanses of small stones, rust red and black and ochre stretching to horizons that shimmered with heat mirages. Then the landscape began to fold and crack, ancient watercourses cutting through the stone, channels that might see water once every 5 or 10 years when rare storms came. Scattered vegetation appeared, dollar bush with its round leaves, isolated acacia trees that looked dead but weren't, their deep roots tapping water sources far underground. In the distance to the south, they could see the beginning of the Great Dune Sea, walls of sand that moved slowly across the landscape like frozen waves. This was one of the oldest deserts on Earth, Henno knew. 30 million years of aridity, of wind and sun, grinding down mountains to sand. The rocks here recorded eons, Precambrian basement stone over 1 billion years old, sedimentary layers from ancient seas, volcanic intrusions from when the continent had torn apart. He and Herman had spent months studying these formations, drilling cores, mapping the underground architecture of water-bearing layers. That knowledge might keep them alive now. They saw animals, signs of the improbable life that persisted here. A gemsbok, oryx in the scientific naming, stood motionless on a ridge, its straight horns like spears against the sky, watching the truck pass with calm indifference. These magnificent antelope could go weeks without drinking, extracting moisture from the plants they ate, allowing their body temperature to rise to levels that would kill most mammals. Evolution had made them perfect for this environment. Henno wondered if he and Herman could adapt even a fraction as well. Springbok tracks crossed the road in places, dozens of small hoofprints heading toward some water source known only to them. A jackal watched from a kopje, calculating whether the truck represented danger or opportunity. Vultures circled in the thermal currents high overhead, their excellent vision scanning for death in the rocks below. Around noon, they reached the edge of the Kuiseb Canyon. One moment they were driving across relatively flat terrain, the next the earth simply dropped away. Henno stopped the truck at the rim, and they got out. Standing at the edge, looking down into the chasm. The canyon was spectacular, a gash in the earth 30 meters deep, maybe more in places, cutting through layers of rock that recorded hundreds of millions of years of geological history. The walls were stepped, different rock types eroding at different rates. Metamorphic schists formed the base, dark and glittering with mica. Above that, sedimentary layers, sandstones and shales in bands of red and gray and cream. The north wall was steep, nearly vertical in sections, sculpted by wind and rare flash floods. The south wall descended more gradually, with caves and overhangs carved into the softer layers. The canyon floor was wide, perhaps 200 meters across, covered in pale sand that reflected the brutal sunlight. Scattered acacia trees grew along what must be the riverbed. The Kuiseb itself, now just a dry, sandy track winding between the walls. During the rare times when rain came to the interior, water would pour through here, a temporary torrent that might last hours or days. But that happened perhaps once a year, sometimes less. The rest of the time, the canyon was silent, waterless, seemingly lifeless. "There," Herman said, pointing downstream. "About 15 kilometers, remember? The large overhang where we found the copper mineralization." Henno remembered. They had been there 8 months earlier, drilling test holes, taking samples. The overhang was substantial, like a great stone roof extending from the south wall, creating a sheltered space perhaps 10 meters deep and 20 wide, high enough to stand in, hidden from casual observation. Perfect. But getting the truck down into the canyon would be treacherous. They drove along the rim, searching for a descent route. Finally, they found a place where a section of the wall had collapsed in some ancient earthquake or flood, creating a steep ramp of broken rock. It looked barely passable. "We could leave the truck up here," Herman suggested. "Carry what we need down. And if we need to leave quickly, if Herman gets sick, if there's an emergency." Henno shook his head. "We'd take it down." The descent was the most frightening thing Henno had done in his life. He put the truck in its lowest gear and crept forward, wheels crunching over loose stones. The slope was perhaps 30 degrees, steep enough that the truck's nose pointed down at an angle that made his stomach clench. Rock shifted under the tires. Once, the rear wheels broke free and the truck slid sideways a meter before catching on a boulder. Herman had gone pale, gripping the door handle. Otto whimpered. Henno kept the wheels turning, using the engine for brake and power simultaneously, steering around the largest obstacles. Sweat poured down his face despite the breeze through the windows. One mistake and the truck would roll, tumbling down the slope, crushing them, destroying everything they needed to survive. It took 20 minutes to descend 50 vertical meters. When they finally reached the canyon floor, Henno stopped the truck and sat shaking, his hands trembling so badly he couldn't hold the steering wheel. Herman reached over and gripped his shoulder. "Well, done," Herman said quietly. "I didn't think we'd make it." "Neither did I." They drove along the canyon floor, following the riverbed. The sand was firm enough to support the truck's weight, though occasionally they had to detour around soft spots or fallen rocks. The walls rose on either side, cutting off the wind, trapping the heat. It felt like driving through a furnace. The temperature inside the truck must have been 45 degrees or more. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached the overhang. It was exactly as Henno remembered, a massive shelf of erosion-resistant sandstone projecting from the south wall. Beneath it, a cave-like space that extended back into shadow. The floor was sand, clean and level. The ceiling showed marks from ancient water flow, smooth curves carved by floods perhaps thousands of years ago. The opening faced north, meaning it would be shaded most of the day. It was as good as they could possibly hope for. They drove the truck inside, as far back as it would go, until the ceiling got too low. Then Henno turned off the engine, and they sat in sudden silence. The only sound was their breathing and Otto's panting and the faint whisper of wind across the canyon rim far above. Herman said, and laughed, though there was no humor in it. They climbed out of the truck stiffly, their bodies aching from the long drive and the tension of the descent. The cave was cooler than outside, still hot but bearable. The rock walls held the night's cold, releasing it slowly through the day. Henno walked to the entrance and looked out at the canyon. The opposite wall glowed red-orange in the afternoon sun. A raven called from somewhere upstream, its harsh cry echoing off the stone. Otherwise silence, absolute silence. They had arrived. This would be their world now, this canyon, these rocks, this handful of sand and sky. How long they would stay, neither could say, until the war ended, perhaps, or until they died, or until someone found them and dragged them back to internment. They did not speak these possibilities aloud. Instead, they worked. Unloading the truck took the rest of the afternoon. Everything came out, the heavy sacks of flour and rice, the crates of canned goods, the tools wrapped in canvas, the blankets and clothes, the rifle and ammunition, the precious radio in its protective case. They arranged it all along the cave walls, organizing by type and frequency of use. Food in the coolest, darkest section. Tools near the entrance where they'd be used, water containers, empty now except for what they'd brought, stacked ready to fill. They built a fire pit outside the cave entrance using flat stones from the canyon floor, arranging them in a circle and building a low wall on the windward side to shield flames. They gathered dead wood from the acacia trees, wood that had probably been dead for years in this dry climate, preserved like mummies. They had to ration firewood as carefully as food. There wasn't much, and it grew slowly here. As the sun sank toward the western wall of the canyon, the temperature dropped rapidly. Desert nights were cold, especially in the southern winter they were entering. Heno guessed it might reach freezing by dawn. They built a small fire, not for warmth yet, but to cook. Herman opened tins of beans and meat, mixing them in a pot with water from their jerry cans. The smell of cooking made Otto dance with excitement, his tail a blur. They ate sitting on the sand outside the cave, watching darkness fill the canyon like water filling a bowl. The walls faded from red to purple to black. Stars appeared, so many stars that the sky seemed more light than dark. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of milk, the name suddenly making perfect sense. Heno had seen dark skies before, but never like this. There was no light pollution for hundreds of kilometers. This was how humans had seen the night sky for millennia, before cities and electricity had washed it out. "My God," Herman whispered. "It's beautiful." It was beautiful. It was also terrifying. They were so small, so vulnerable, two men and a dog in an immensity that did not care whether they lived or died. Heno felt the weight of it pressing down, the vast indifference of stone and sand and sky. He wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. That first night they slept badly despite exhaustion. Every sound seemed magnified, the whisper of sand moving in the breeze, the crack of cooling rock, distant cries that might have been jackals or birds, or their imagination. Otto whimpered in his sleep, dreaming dog dreams. Heno lay on his blanket, staring up at the cave ceiling, invisible in the darkness, thinking about everything they had left behind. His family in Germany. Were they safe? Did they know where he was? Would he ever see them again? Herman tossed and turned nearby, clearly having similar thoughts. At some point, Heno must have slept because he woke to grey pre-dawn light filtering into the cave and the sound of Herman already up, building the fire. The morning was bitterly cold. Their breath made clouds in the air. Heno's joints ached as he stood. He was 30 years old, but felt ancient. "Coffee," Herman offered. "God, yes." They stood close to the fire, warming their hands on tin cups of black coffee made strong and sweet the way they both liked it. As the sun rose and light poured into the canyon, filling it like golden water, Heno felt his spirits lift slightly. They were here, they had made it, now they just had to survive. "First priority," Heno said, "is water. We brought 20 liters, which gives us maybe 4 days if we're careful. We need to find a local source today." Herman nodded. "I'll search upstream, you search down. We meet back here by noon. Take Otto with you, and the rifle, just in case." "What about you?" "I have the pistol, and I'm just looking for water, not trouble." They divided the tools. Herman took a shovel and pickaxe. Heno took another shovel and the geological survey maps they had made months earlier. The maps showed suspected aquifer locations based on rock formations and vegetation patterns. Those surveys might save their lives now. Heno walked downstream, studying the canyon floor with professional attention. He was looking for signs that most people would miss. Vegetation slightly greener than elsewhere, suggesting moisture below. Sand darker or finer, indicating water had been there recently. Subtle changes in the rock layers exposed in the canyon walls, showing where permeable sandstone might channel groundwater. This was what he had trained for, what he had spent 5 years doing in this territory. Now it was not just professional work, but survival. About a kilometer from camp, he found something promising, a small grove of acacia trees, their leaves greener than they should be in the dry season, growing in a depression in the canyon floor. He knelt and dug his hand into the sand. At about 6 inches it was cool. At 12 inches it was damp. His heart rate increased. He began to dig with the shovel, carefully creating a hole about a meter across. The sand came away easily, piling beside the hole. At 2 feet he hit mud. At 3 feet water began to seep in, not flowing, just a slow accumulation. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard from exertion, and watched the water level slowly rise. It took about 20 minutes to accumulate enough to dip his hand in. He brought it to his lips cautiously, tasted it. Slightly brackish, slightly bitter, but drinkable. Not pleasant, but safe enough if boiled. He marked the spot with a cairn of rocks so he could find it again, then continued downstream to see if there were other sources. He found 2 more possible locations, though neither was as promising as the first. By the time he returned to camp, it was mid-morning and the heat was building. Herman was already back, looking pleased. Found one, about a kilometer up. Deep. Had to dig down 4 feet, but it's there. Good flow, too, better than I expected. I found one as well. Not as good as yours sounds, but adequate. They had water, not abundant, not convenient, but sufficient. It was the most important milestone. Without water, they would have been dead in 3 days. With it, they might survive indefinitely. The next challenge was food. They had brought supplies, yes, but those would last only a few months, even with careful rationing. They needed to hunt. Over the following days, they established their camp more thoroughly. They built a low wall of stones across the cave entrance to keep out wind and animals. They dug a drainage trench around the outside to divert water if flash floods came. Unlikely, but catastrophic if they weren't prepared. They hung their canvas tarps inside the cave to create separate areas, giving each man some privacy, not much, but enough to preserve sanity. They covered the truck with canvas and branches, camouflaging it. The truck was their insurance policy, their escape route if everything went wrong. The gasoline they had brought, perhaps 50 liters in sealed drums, they buried under sand in the coolest part of the cave to prevent evaporation and keep it hidden. They practiced with the rifle, shooting at rocks at various distances, getting used to how heat, shimmer, and wind affected the bullet's path. The .22 was not a powerful weapon, but it was accurate and economical. Each bullet had to count. They could not afford to waste ammunition on missed shots. Herman proved to be the better marksman. His hands were steadier, his patience greater. Henno was the better tracker, with an intuitive sense for where animals might be found. They made a good team. On the 10th day, Herman shot their first springbok. He had been gone since dawn, following tracks upstream. Henno heard the distant crack of the rifle and felt his stomach clench. One shot could mean success or failure. If Herman had missed and spooked the animal, it might be days before they found game again. Herman returned 3 hours later, carrying meat wrapped in canvas, his shirt soaked with blood and sweat, grinning like a boy. "Got him," he said simply. They hung the meat in the shadiest part of the cave, working quickly before flies found it. They cut thin strips and laid them in the sun on flat rocks. Biltong, the dried meat that would last weeks if made properly. They cooked the liver immediately, frying it in their pan over the fire, and ate it while it was still pink inside. It was the best thing Henno had tasted in weeks. The fat and protein sang in his veins. His body, which had been running on stored reserves and canned food, seemed to wake up. That night they celebrated with an extra cup of coffee and an hour of radio time instead of the usual 30 minutes. They tuned into the BBC, listening to news from Europe. France had fallen. Britain stood alone now, bombed nightly, but still fighting. It seemed impossibly distant, those great battles and political dramas. What did it matter who controlled Paris when the real struggle was here, in this canyon, to find water and food and survive another day? But it did matter. Henno knew the war would determine how long they had to stay hidden. If Germany won quickly, perhaps they could emerge, return to some kind of normal life. If the war dragged on for years, he didn't want to think about that. As May turned to June and June to July, they settled into routines. They had to, because routine was psychological survival. Wake at dawn, build the fire, make coffee and porridge. One man walks to the water source, bails out the accumulated water. It took about 4 trips, carrying 2 jerry cans, 16 liters total, enough for one day between 2 men and a dog. The other man hunts or gathers firewood or maintains the camp. They traded off daily, keeping it Fair afternoons were for resting during the worst heat. They would retreat to the back of the cave where it was coolest, lie on their blankets, read their few books, or write in their notebooks. Sometimes they talked, but often they were silent, each man lost in thought. The silence of the desert was so complete that conversation seemed like an intrusion. Evenings were better. They would cook dinner, meat if they had it, rice and beans if they didn't. They had learned to bake bread in their Dutch oven. Burying it in coals and fresh bread with meat made them feel almost civilized. After dinner came the radio, that precious connection to the world beyond their canyon. Then sleep, exhausted, but somehow never quite rested. By August 1940, 3 months into their exile, the initial excitement of escape had faded into something harder and more grinding. Survival was no longer an adventure, but a job, exhausting, repetitive, occasionally terrifying. The canyon that had seemed like salvation now felt like a prison with walls of stone instead of wire. The cold had intensified. Winter in the Namib was not the winter of their German childhoods, with snow and Christmas markets and warm houses. But the nights dropped below freezing regularly now, and the days, though still warm in direct sunlight, carried a biting wind that seemed to find every gap in their clothing. They woke each morning to frost on the rocks outside the cave, crystals of ice that vanished within minutes of sunrise but left everything damp and cold. Their bodies had changed. Both men had lost weight despite eating as much as they could. The physical labor of survival, walking kilometers daily to fetch water, hunting, gathering firewood, maintaining camp, burned calories faster than their limited diet could replace them. Henno's pants, which had fit snugly 3 months ago, now hung loose on his hips, held up by a belt cinched 2 notches tighter than before. His face had become gaunt, cheekbones prominent, eyes seeming larger. Herman looked similar, though his frame carried the weight loss better, his naturally solid build making him look lean rather than starved. Their hands had transformed into tools. Calluses covered their palms and fingers, thick as leather. Henno's right palm had a permanent callus from carrying the jerry cans by their handles. Herman's hands bore scars from butchering animals, thin white lines across his knuckles where a knife had slipped. Both men's fingernails were cracked and broken, permanently stained with dirt that no amount of washing could remove. Their minds had changed too. Henno found himself thinking about water constantly, obsessively. How much was left in the jerry cans? When had they last filled them? What if the seep dried up? He would wake in the night from dreams of flowing streams and return to the reality of rationed sips from a tin cup. 3 liters per person per day, 4 for Otto. Enough to survive, but not enough to ever feel satisfied. The thirst was always there, a background ache like tinnitus. Time had become elastic, meaningless. They marked the days in their notebooks. Henno kept a meticulous diary, recording weather and wildlife and their own condition, but the numbers seemed abstract. What difference did it make if it was August 15th or August 20th, when every day followed the same pattern? Wake, fetch water, hunt or maintain, rest, eat, radio, sleep, repeat. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. They spoke less than they had at first. Not from any conflict, but simply because there was less to say. They knew each other's stories now, had exhausted the topics of their pasts. The present offered little worth discussing. Another springbok killed, another seep gone dry and relocated, another cold night. The future was too uncertain to plan, so they existed together in companionable silence, 2 men alone in immensity. The isolation worked on them in strange ways. Henno found himself talking to Otto more than to Herman some days, explaining his thoughts to the dog as they walked to the water source together. Otto would listen with cocked head and intelligent eyes, occasionally offering a bark or whine that Henno interpreted as agreement or encouragement. It was madness, perhaps, but it helped. Herman had taken to singing while he worked. Old German folk songs from childhood, university drinking songs, sometimes just wordless melodies. His voice, rough but not unpleasant, would echo off the canyon walls. They dreamed about the past constantly. Henno would close his eyes and see his mother's kitchen in Freiburg, smell bread baking, hear the church bells on Sunday morning. He remembered a girl he had known at university, Greta, with her dark eyes and quick laugh. He had been too shy to tell her he loved her, and then he had left for Africa, and now she was probably married to someone else. Did she remember him? Did anyone remember him? Or had he simply vanished from the world, erased like footprints in sand? Herman spoke rarely of his past, but sometimes at night, exhausted and half asleep by the fire, he would murmur names. Elsa, he said once, so softly Henno almost didn't hear. When Henno asked who Elsa was, Herman shook his head. Someone I knew, long ago. He never mentioned her again. They had stopped talking about the future. At first they had made plans. When the war ends, we'll go back to Windhoek, resume our work, publish papers about our geological findings here. We'll be famous, the men who survived the Namib. But as the radio brought news of escalating war, the Blitz pounding London, Germany seemingly unstoppable, those plans felt increasingly hollow. What if the war lasted 5 years, 10? What if Germany won and they returned to a world run by Nazis? What if they died here and no one ever found their bones? So they stopped planning and focused only on the immediate. Today's water, today's food, tonight's warmth. The future could take care of itself. The hunting had become both easier and harder. Easier because they had learned the patterns, where animals came to drink, what times of day they moved, how to approach downwind. Herman's shooting had improved to the point where he rarely missed. They had developed an efficient system for butchering and preserving meat, but harder because the game was scarce and getting scarcer. The dry season was deepening, and animals were moving away, following some ancient knowledge of where water might still be found. Some days they saw nothing, despite walking 20 kilometers. Those were anxious days. They had killed perhaps 15 springbok over 3 months, and 1 gemsbok, a magnificent bull with horns over a meter long that Herman had shot at 70 meters. A difficult shot made more difficult by shaking hands. It had taken 2 bullets, both in the chest, before the animal went down. The gemsbok had nearly killed them in a different way. The carcass was huge, perhaps 200 kilograms. Far too much meat for 2 men to process quickly in the heat. They had worked frantically, cutting strips for biltong, smoking meat over green wood fires, their arms aching, surrounded by flies that appeared within minutes and covered everything. Even working from dawn until after dark, they had lost perhaps a third of the meat to spoilage. The waste haunted Henno. That animal had died to feed them, and they had failed it. They supplemented meat with what little else the desert offered. The Nara melons, when they could find them, provided moisture and vitamins. The melons grew on ugly, sprawling vines protected by vicious thorns, and harvesting them meant bleeding hands and torn clothes. But the flesh inside was sweet and watery, almost like cucumber. They ate the seeds, too, roasting them until they cracked. The taste nutty and pleasant. There were edible roots if you knew where to dig. Certain acacias had seed pods that could be ground into flour. Occasionally they found beetles, fat and protein-rich, which they roasted and ate despite the crunching texture. Henno had never imagined eating insects, but after 3 months in the desert, protein was protein. The taste was not unpleasant, actually, smoky and nutty. Otto adapted better than either man. The terrier had gone half wild, his hunting instincts fully awakened. He could catch lizards and rodents, supplementing his diet when their supplies ran low. He learned to dig for scorpions, somehow avoiding their stings. He rationed his own water, seeming to understand they had little to spare. At night he slept between the 2 men, his warm body a comfort. He had been wounded once by a gemsbok, gored by a horn when he got too close during a hunt, and had limped for 2 weeks before healing. After that, he was more careful. One morning in late August, Henno woke before dawn with a strange feeling, a tension in the air, a heaviness. The sky, when he emerged from the cave, was different. Clouds covered the stars, thick and low, moving fast from the west. The wind had shifted, bringing a smell he had not experienced in months, the smell of rain. "Herman," he called, "wake up! I think it's going to rain." They scrambled to prepare. They spread every canvas they had, positioning them to channel water into their containers. They set out pots and pans and cups, anything that could catch water. They moved the firewood under cover, then they waited. The first drops came at sunrise, fat and heavy, splattering in the dust and disappearing instantly. Then more, faster, the patter becoming a roar, as the rain intensified. Within minutes, it was a downpour, water falling so hard it bounced off the rocks, creating a mist. The smell was incredible, petrichor, that distinctive scent of rain on dry earth, but amplified 1,000 times. The dust rose up to meet the water, releasing compounds that had been locked away for months. They stood in it, heads back, mouths open, laughing like children. Water ran down their faces, soaked their clothes, puddled around their feet. Otto raced in circles, barking joyfully, snapping at the drops. It was the most water they had seen in 3 months, falling from the sky as if the universe had decided to be generous for once. The rain lasted perhaps 20 minutes, then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun, the clouds moving on eastward, leaving them dripping and cold, but elated. They had collected perhaps 50 liters in their various containers, more water than they could carry to camp in a week of trips to the seep. But the rain brought danger too. Within an hour they heard it, a low roar from upstream growing louder. Flash flood. The Kuiseb was flowing. They ran to the canyon floor to watch. A wall of water came around the bend, brown and roiling, carrying branches and debris and foam. It was perhaps 2 meters high, moving with terrifying speed. If they had been sleeping on the canyon floor, they would have been swept away and drowned. As it was, they were safe in their cave 10 meters above the flood line, but the sight was awe-inspiring and terrifying. The water raged through the canyon for perhaps 2 hours, then began to subside. By afternoon, it was just a stream. By evening, a series of pools. Within 3 days, it would be mostly gone, soaked into the sand or evaporated. But for those 3 days, they had unlimited water. They washed their clothes properly for the first time in months, scrubbing them with sand and soap, hanging them to dry in the sun. They washed themselves, luxuriating in the feel of clean skin. They filled every container they had, knowing this gift would not come again soon. The rain also brought life. Within days, the canyon transformed. Seeds that had lain dormant in the sand for years, perhaps decades, sprouted. A green haze covered the ground. Flowers bloomed, tiny and delicate, but incredibly numerous, painting the sand with colors. Insects appeared from nowhere. Butterflies and beetles and bees, birds arrived, weavers and finches and shrikes, feeding on the insect explosion. The desert, which had seemed dead, was suddenly vibrantly alive, and the game returned. Herds of springbok came to drink at the pools. Gemsbok appeared on the ridges. Zebras, which they had not seen at all in the previous months, arrived in small family groups. For 2 weeks, hunting was easy. They killed 3 springbok and smoked enough meat to last a month. They felt wealthy, secure, but the abundance was brief. As the water disappeared, so did the animals. The green faded to brown, the flowers died, the insects vanished. Within a month, the canyon looked as it had before the rain, dry, harsh, minimal. Except now they knew it was temporary. Life was hiding, waiting. The desert was not dead, but sleeping. September became October, spring in the southern hemisphere, though spring meant little in the Namib. The temperatures climbed again as summer approached. The nights stopped freezing, but the days became brutal, climbing past 40 degrees regularly. They adjusted their routine, waking earlier, sleeping during the midday heat, becoming active again in the evening. They became nocturnal creatures like the animals they hunted. The radio brought increasingly disturbing news. The Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe trying to bomb England into submission, the Blitz intensifying, London burning night after night. Henno listened and felt guilty for his safety. People were dying while he hid in a canyon, worried only about water and meat. But what could he do? Return to internment so he could feel virtuous. That helped no one. In October, they had their first serious quarrel. It started over something trivial. Herman had used more than his share of their dwindling coffee supply. Henno had been saving his ration carefully, a small cup each morning, making it last. But when he went to measure out his portion, he found the tin nearly empty. "You've been taking extra," Henno said, trying to keep his voice level. "I have not," Herman replied, defensive. "The tin was half full 3 days ago. Now it's nearly empty. We're supposed to ration it. We agreed." "Perhaps you miscounted. Perhaps we used more than you thought." "I know exactly how much we had. You took extra." Herman's face flushed with anger. "Are you calling me a thief?" "I'm saying you took more than your share, and I'm saying you're wrong, mistaken, or lying." The words hung in the air like smoke, lying. In 3 months together, they had never accused each other of dishonesty. It was a line crossed. "I am not lying," Henno said coldly. The coffee is gone. One of us took it. It wasn't me. Therefore you assume it was me, without proof, just accusation. What other explanation is there? That you're mistaken, that you're so obsessed with rationing and measuring and controlling every gram of food that you've lost. Perspective. Perhaps you took extra and forgot. Perhaps Otto knocked over the tin and it spilled. Perhaps you're the one who's lost perspective, Henno snapped. Perhaps living in this hole is driving you mad. Hermann stood abruptly, fists clenched. For a moment, Henno thought his friend might actually hit him. They faced each other in the cave, both breathing hard, both furious. Otto whimpered, sensing the tension. Then Hermann turned and walked out, disappearing into the afternoon heat. Henno stood alone, shaking with anger and something else, fear. They could not afford conflict. They needed each other to survive. If their partnership broke down, they were both dead. He sat down heavily on a rock, head in his hands. Was he being unreasonable? Had he miscounted? No, he certainly hadn't. But did it matter? Was he willing to destroy their friendship over a few cups of coffee? Hermann returned hours later, after dark. He sat down by the fire without speaking. Henno prepared their dinner, beans and rice, no meat today, and they ate in silence. The tension was unbearable. Finally, Hermann spoke. "You were right. I took extra coffee. I'm sorry." Henno looked up, surprised. "Why?" "I was tired, exhausted. The coffee helps me wake up, helps me think. I told myself I'd just take a little extra just once, then I took more and more. It was stupid, selfish. I'm sorry." The apology was so honest, so vulnerable that Henno's anger evaporated. "I'm sorry, too, for how I reacted, for being so rigid about everything." "No, you're right to be rigid. We have to be careful, disciplined. If we're not—" Hermann shrugged. "I won't take extra again. You have my word." They shook hands, awkwardly, formally, like businessmen concluding a deal. But the gesture helped. The tension eased. They were partners again. That night, lying in his blanket, Henno realized something important. The desert was testing them. Not just physically, but psychologically. The isolation, the stress, the constant background fear of death. It wore away at civilization, at the social contracts that held people together. They were becoming primitive, territorial, suspicious. They had to resist that, had to maintain their humanity deliberately, consciously. Otherwise, the desert would win, not by killing their bodies, but by killing their souls. November brought searing heat. Temperatures climbed past 45 degrees most days, sometimes reaching 50. The cave became an oven, despite the shade. They moved deeper into it, into the coolest section, and did nothing during the worst hours except lie still and try not to think about heat. Moving meant sweating. Sweating meant needing more water. More water meant more trips to the seep. It was a vicious cycle. The seep itself began to fail. The water level dropped steadily as the drought deepened. Henno would bail it out in the morning, and by evening only a few centimeters had accumulated instead of the usual 12 or 15. They had to dig deeper, widening the hole, chasing the water as it retreated into the ground. Some mornings the hole was empty, just damp sand, and they had to wait hours for enough to accumulate. They reduced their ration to 2.5 liters per person, then to 2 liters. Otto got 3 liters, which seemed generous, but dogs needed water more than humans in heat. The constant thirst became maddening. Henno's lips cracked and bled. His urine turned dark orange, concentrated. He felt dizzy standing up, his heart racing as his body tried to compensate for reduced blood volume. Hermann developed a cough, dry and persistent, probably from the dust and heat. It kept him awake at night, kept Henno awake too. They had aspirin, but no real medicine for respiratory problems. The cough got worse, became painful. Hermann would double over, hacking, his face turning red. Sometimes he coughed so hard he vomited what little food was in his stomach. "You need to see a doctor," Henno said. "There is no doctor. There's only you and me and this damned canyon. Then we need to leave, get you to Windhoek, to a hospital. And then what? Internment, prison. While I'm still coughing," Hermann shook his head. "No, it'll pass, just a cough, the heat and dust. Once summer ends. Summer's just started. We have 4 more months of this. Then I'll cough for 4 more months." Hermann's voice was stubborn, but Henno heard the fear underneath. Herman was scared too. The cough did improve eventually, though it never fully went away. Herman learned to manage it, to minimize breathing dust, to drink more water when he could, but it weakened him. He lost more weight, his face becoming skull-like. When they hunted together, he had to stop frequently to rest, hands on knees, fighting for breath. In December, they celebrated Christmas, or tried to. They had no calendar except their notebooks, so they chose December 25th, somewhat arbitrarily, marking it with a special meal. They killed a springbok the day before, roasted the best cuts over the fire, made bread with their dwindling flour supply. They even used a tiny amount of their hoarded sugar to make something approximating Christmas cookies, though they were hard and tasteless. They sang Christmas carols, Silent Night in German, O Come All Ye Faithful in English, their voices echoing off the stone. They opened the radio and listened to Christmas broadcasts from South Africa, hearing familiar music that made them both weep. "Two absent friends," Herman said, raising his tin cup of water in a toast. "Two absent friends," Henno echoed, "and to present ones." They clinked cups and drank, and tried not to think about how many more Christmases they might spend in this canyon. By late 1942, they had been in the canyon for 2.5 years. 2.5 years of heat and cold, thirst and hunger, silence and stone. They had survived far longer than Henno had thought possible. First night when they drove away from Windhoek. The war continued. The radio told them that much. North Africa had become a battlefield. Rommel's Africa Corps pushing toward Egypt, then being pushed back. The Americans had entered the war. The tide seemed to be turning slowly against Germany, but the end was not yet in sight. They had changed in ways that went beyond the physical, though the physical changes were dramatic enough. Henno barely recognized himself when he caught his reflection in the truck's side mirror. His face was burned nearly black by the sun, lined and leathered like old boots. His hair, which he cut himself with scissors when it got too long, was shot through with gray. Despite his being only 32 years old, his body was all sinew and bone, no fat left anywhere. He moved differently now, economically, carefully, like the animals he hunted. No wasted motion, no unnecessary effort. Herman looked worse. The cough had returned in the winter and never fully left. He was thin to the point of emaciation, his clothes hanging on his frame. His eyes had sunken deep into their sockets, giving him a haunted look. His hands shook sometimes, a fine tremor that he tried to hide, but Henno noticed. Something was wrong, something beyond simple malnutrition and stress. It started subtly in October 1942. Herman complained of pain in his legs after their daily water runs. "Just sore," he said. "Getting old." He was perhaps 35, hardly old, but the canyon aged people in dog years. Henno didn't push it, but the pain got worse. Herman began to limp, favoring his right leg, then both legs. He moved stiffly like his joints had rusted. One morning he didn't get up at dawn as usual. Henno found him still in his blanket, face pale, sweating despite the morning cool. "Can't move," Herman whispered. "Legs won't work. Everything hurts." Henno helped him sit up. Herman's legs were swollen, the flesh puffy and strange. When Henno pressed a finger into the swelling, it left an indentation that took minutes to fill back in. The pain, Herman said through gritted teeth, was everywhere. Legs, back, neck, head, like his whole body was being crushed. "How long has this been going on?" Henno demanded. "Weeks. Getting worse. I thought it would pass." "Why didn't you tell me? What could you do? We're trapped here, Henno. No doctors, no medicine. We survive or we don't." But this was different from their usual ailments. This was serious, possibly fatal. Henno searched his memory of medical training, limited, just basic first aid from university, and tried to diagnose. Swelling in the extremities, pain, weakness. It could be heart disease, kidney failure, any number of things. But there was one possibility that made horrible sense. Beriberi. Vitamin B1 deficiency, common in populations that ate only polished rice or limited diets lacking thiamine. Symptoms included pain, weakness, swelling, heart problems. If left untreated, it could cause paralysis and death. And they had been eating a monotonous diet for 2.5 years. Dried meat, rice, beans, whatever they could scavenge. No fresh vegetables, no variety. Of course, their bodies were breaking down. "I think it's beriberi," Henno said. Vitamin deficiency. Can we treat it here? Henno shook his head. You need thiamine, vitamin B1. We don't have it. We'd need fresh vegetables, whole grains, meat organs we've been throwing away. We need real food, Herman. Medical care. Then I'm dead. No. Henno's voice was firm. We're leaving. I'm taking you to Windhoek. They'll arrest us. I don't care. You'll die if we stay. You might die anyway if we don't get you treatment soon. Herman was silent for a long time. Finally, he nodded. All right. When? Today. Now. We load the truck and go. But it took 2 days to prepare. Herman was too weak to help much, so Henno did everything, packing their essential belongings, burying what they couldn't carry, filling the truck with gasoline from their buried drums. He shot one last springbok and smoked the meat quickly, knowing they might need food for the journey. He filled every water container. He checked the truck's tires, engine, everything. It had been 2.5 years since they had driven it. Would it even start? It did, after some coaxing. The engine coughed and sputtered but caught, settling into a rough idle. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The gasoline had deteriorated slightly, but it would run. On November 15, 1942, they prepared to leave. Henno helped Herman into the truck cab. His friend could barely walk now, had to be practically carried. Otto jumped in after them, tail wagging, sensing they were going somewhere. The dog had thrived in the desert, but he was ready for change too. Henno took one last look at the cave that had been their home. 2.5 years. It looked small now, just a shadow in the rock face. The fire pit was cold ashes. Their stone wall was falling down. The canyon would erase all trace of them within a few years, wind and sand covering their footprints. It was as if they had never been here. He put the truck in gear and drove out of the cave, along the canyon floor, toward the ramp they had descended a lifetime ago. The ascent was even more terrifying than the descent had been. The truck labored, wheels spinning on loose rock, threatening to slide backward. But they made it to the rim and the vast gravel plains beyond. The drive to Windhoek took 2 days. They drove slowly, both to conserve fuel and because the rough roads made Herman cry out in pain at every jolt. They camped one night on the veldt, building a small fire, watching stars that looked the same as they had from the canyon. But everything else was different. They were no longer hiding. They were returning to the world. They reached Windhoek on November 17th, driving through streets that seemed impossibly crowded after 2.5 years of solitude. There were cars and people and noise and colors. Henno felt overwhelmed, almost panicked. Too much stimulus, too much life. Herman slumped in the passenger seat, barely conscious. Henno drove straight to the hospital. He carried Herman inside, calling for help. Doctors and nurses came running, took one look at Herman's condition, and wheeled him away immediately. Someone asked Henno questions. Who was this man? What had happened to him? His name is Herman Korn, Henno said. He's very sick. I think it's beriberi. We've been living in the Kuiseb Canyon for 2.5 years. Please help him. The nurse's eyes widened. The Kuiseb? You're the Germans who disappeared. Everyone thought you were dead. We nearly were. Please just help him. They took Herman to a ward and began treatment immediately. Thiamine injections, fluids, proper food. Henno sat in the waiting room, filthy and exhausted, Otto at his feet. Eventually police came. They were polite but firm. He was under arrest as an enemy alien. He would be held pending investigation. Can I see my friend first? Henno asked. I need to know he'll live. They let him see Herman briefly. His friend lay in a hospital bed, attached to tubes and monitors, but his color was already better. The doctors were optimistic he would recover with treatment, though he would need weeks in hospital. You saved my life, Herman whispered. You would have done the same. Will I see you again? I don't know. Probably. They can't punish us for surviving. But Herman's expression said he wasn't sure about that. Henno was taken to the police station, questioned, then transferred to a cell. It was clean, had a bed, had a toilet. After 2.5 years in a cave, it seemed luxurious despite being a jail. They brought him food, Real food, vegetables and bread and fruit, and he ate until he was sick. His stomach had shrunk, couldn't handle richness. After 3 days, Herman, from his hospital bed, told the authorities where Henno was, urged by friends who visited him. Henno was brought to the hospital, then both were briefly jailed together as their case was sorted out. The authorities didn't quite know what to do with them. They had broken no laws, technically. They had simply refused internment and hidden in the desert. Eventually they were released with small fines for minor infractions, failure to register as enemy aliens, hunting without proper licenses, that sort of thing. The judge seemed more amused than angry. 2.5 years in the Kuiseb, he said, shaking his head. You gentlemen are either very brave or very foolish, possibly both. Try to stay out of trouble from now on. They were free, or as free as enemy aliens could be during wartime. Herman recovered slowly in hospital, regaining strength as the vitamins restored his body's functions. Henno stayed in Windhoek, working odd jobs, visiting Herman daily. Otto stayed with Henno, adapting surprisingly well to town life, though he would sometimes stare at the horizon as if remembering wide spaces. The war in North Africa ended in 1943 with Allied victory. Germany began to lose on all fronts. In 1945, Hitler killed himself in his bunker and Germany surrendered. The war was over. They had survived, both the desert and the war. Herman Korn was never quite the same after the beriberi. He recovered most of his strength, but remained frail, moved carefully, tired easily. He went back to work as a geologist after the war, but the desert had taken something from him. In 1946, driving on a remote road on a geological survey, his truck went off the road and rolled. He was killed instantly. He was perhaps 39 years old. Henno Martin was devastated. Herman had been his closest friend, his partner in the most extraordinary experience of his life. They had survived the impossible together, only for Herman to die in an ordinary accident 4 years later. It seemed cruel, meaningless, but Henno continued. He had always been a survivor. He returned to his geological work, becoming one of the most respected geologists in Southwest Africa. He made important discoveries, including the Mesem crater, an ancient volcanic structure. He directed water-finding operations for Windhoek, using the skills he had honed in the canyon. He eventually became head of the Geological Survey of Namibia. He also taught, professor of geology in Cape Town, South Africa, then later in Göttingen, Germany, returning to his homeland after decades away. He trained a new generation of geologists, teaching them not just science, but respect for the power of nature. But his most important work was writing. In 1957, 17 years after their escape to the desert, Henno published a book about their experience. In German it was called Wenn es Krieg gibt, gehen wir in die Wüste. If there is war, we will go to the desert. In English, simply, The Sheltering Desert. The book was honest, unflinching, beautiful. Henno wrote about the hunger and thirst, the fear and loneliness, the moments of transcendent beauty when the desert revealed itself in sunset or starlight. He wrote about Herman, preserving his friend's memory, honoring the man who had shared those 2.5 years. He wrote about Otto, the faithful terrier who had survived attacks by Gemsbok, who had hunted beside them, who had been their companion when human company failed. The book became a bestseller, translated into dozens of languages. People were fascinated by the story. Two intellectuals choosing freedom over safety, surviving through knowledge and determination and luck. It inspired other survival narratives, influenced writers and filmmakers. It became a classic. Henno lived a long life. He remained in Namibia as Southwest Africa was renamed after independence in 1990 until his death. He died in his 80s, an old man who had seen his homeland destroyed and rebuilt, who had witnessed the end of colonialism, who had survived the unsurvivable. Otto, the wire-haired terrier who had been their constant companion, lived for several years after their return. He had been wounded twice in the desert, gored by Gemsbok horns, but had survived, tough as the land that had shaped him. He disappeared one day in Windhoek, simply wandered off and never returned. Henno searched for weeks, but never found him. He liked to imagine that Otto had gone back to the desert somehow, returning to the place where he had been truly alive. The Kuiseb Canyon remained, indifferent to their drama. The cave where they had lived was visited occasionally by curious people who had read the book. The fire pit they had built eroded away. The water seep they had depended on still flowed, still providing life to any creature patient enough to dig for it. The canyon existed outside human time, outside human concerns. It had sheltered them for 2.5 years and would continue for millennia after they were forgotten. Years later, scientists studying survival psychology would examine their story. How had two men maintained sanity in such isolation? How had they avoided the conflicts that destroyed other partnerships in extreme conditions? The answer, Heno suggested when asked, was simple: respect, routine, and purpose. They had respected each other's space and needs. They had maintained routines that gave structure to chaos. And they had kept their purpose, scientific observation, which gave meaning beyond mere survival. But there was something else too, something harder to quantify. Love, perhaps. Not romantic love, but the deep bond that forms between people who have faced death together and survived. They had saved each other in 100 small ways every day for 2.5 years. That created a connection deeper than friendship, stronger than blood. In the end, their story was not really about the desert at all, though the desert was magnificent and terrible and beautiful. It was about what humans can endure when they must, about the choices we make between safety and freedom, about the price of survival and whether it's worth paying. Heno Martin thought it was. He never regretted those 2.5 years. Despite the hunger and thirst, despite losing Herman, despite everything, because in that canyon, stripped of all civilization's comforts, he had discovered something essential about himself. He was stronger than he knew, more adaptable, more capable of joy in small things. A successful hunt, cool water, the sound of rain, Herman's laugh, Otto's warm body against his side at night. The desert had taught him that humans could survive almost anything if they had reason to. His reason had been freedom, Herman's too. They had chosen to be free men in a harsh land rather than prisoners in a comfortable camp. That choice had nearly killed them, but it had also revealed who they truly were. In his old age, sitting in a comfortable chair in a comfortable house, Heno would sometimes close his eyes and be back in the canyon. He would feel the heat on his skin, smell the smoke of the fire, hear the wind across the rim, and Herman's voice and Otto's bark. And he would smile, remembering. Those had been the hardest years of his life. They had also been the most real. The desert had sheltered them when the world would not. And in return, they had given it their story, their survival, their proof that even in the harshest environment on Earth, the human spirit could not only endure, but thrive. Their footprints in the sand had long since blown away, but the canyon remembered. And now, through Heno's words, the world remembered too. The geologists who chose the desert over imprisonment, the men who survived the unsurvivable, the proof that freedom, even bought at terrible price, is worth having. In the Kuiseb Canyon, the acacia trees still grow where water hides beneath sand. Gemsboks still drink at the seeps. The leopard's descendants still hunt under stars that have watched over that land for billions of years. And somewhere in the stones and silence, the echo of two men's courage remains, testament to the extraordinary things ordinary people can do when they must. Heno Martin died believing that his time in the desert had been a gift, despite everything. It had stripped away all pretense, all comfort, all the things humans think they need. And in doing so, it had revealed what they actually need: water, food, shelter, purpose. And one other thing, perhaps most important of all, each other. In the end, that was what had saved them. Not their knowledge or their tools or their supplies, but the fact that they had faced the desert together, two men who refused to give up on themselves or each other, who found in that terrible, beautiful place something that civilization could never give them: the chance to be truly free. If you like this incredible story of Heno Martin and Herman Korn, two geologists who survived 2.5 years in one of Earth's harshest deserts, please like and subscribe to this channel. You'll find more amazing stories of survival, escape, and human resilience. Now I ask you, could you survive 2.5 years in the Namib Desert? What 3 items would you absolutely have to bring with you? Write in the comments. I'm curious to know.